to preface the book here. The main key takeaways from this is that this book has an insane amount of detail in the prophecies, and in order for you to really be able to digest and take what it's saying, you need to pay attention. All right, I'm going to try my best to teach you in detail what the prophecies are, but if you really want to learn, you're going to need to honestly focus, and perhaps maybe afterwards reread it and focus on it yourself and digest it some more. It's a long book. It's 12 chapters, so we're probably going to be doing this for the next couple of months. We'll take as long as you guys want, so if you guys have questions, I'll expand on it, and if it takes a couple Sundays to get through a chapter, then so be it. I'm going to try my best to do a chapter a week, but I also understand that once we get into some of the prophecies, it might take 2 Sundays to get through one of them, and I'm fine with that. I'm just letting you guys know, just for transparency up front. All right, go to the next slide. All right, so the design of the book is there are 2 distinct types of writings throughout this book. You have type 1, which is the narrative, and that'll be for chapters 1 through 6. And basically that's going to be covering historic events. It's going to be talking about Daniel's life from captivity in Babylon, and then ultimately how he becomes a worker for the kingdoms that he's serving, and then ultimately the trials and tribulations that he and his group of friends faced during those times. It's mostly about that Gentile history that he's living in and working in. And then you have type 2, which is the prophecy, and this will be chapters 7 through 12. But also I consider chapter 2 also prophetic in nature, and you'll see why next Sunday when we get to it. So I would bundle chapter 2 into that. But mostly the prophecies are contained in 7 through 12.
What's prophetic?
Prophetic? That's just Daniel's prophecies, his visions of the future and things that are going to come.
Okay. Never heard of that word.
No, you're good. And then also, key thing to note is that this book is written in 2 languages. So it's written in Aramaic, and it's also written in Hebrew. So the very beginning, from the very first verse until about the 3rd verse of the 2nd chapter, it's written in Hebrew. And the reason for that is his audience is primarily the Jews, because he's talking about how he was affected by the exile, which we'll cover, and ultimately his conditions and situations that he was living in. Then he switches over to Aramaic, which was the language of the ancient Babylonians, and just that area in general. From chapter 2, verse 4, all the way until the end of chapter 7. And the reason for this is because his primary audience are the Gentiles and the kingdoms that he's living in, because all of this information is pertaining to them and their future, as well as the Jews, but mostly about the Gentile kingdoms that he'll be serving in and following thereafter. And then in chapter 8, verse 1, through the end of the book, he switches back to Hebrew, and the reason why he switches back to Hebrew is because his target audience for that then becomes the Jews again, because the focus is back on those people. All right, so just understand that. Why does it matter? Well, because you need to understand what the language was in order to understand what his intended audience was. Okay? So it just helps contextually as to who he was speaking to and why. Therefore, that's the language he used. Okay? Doesn't really matter for us too much. Just understand that in the back of your mind. All right, go to the next slide. All right, so the reason why I chose the book of Daniel to be our Sunday school lesson is because in my honest belief, it is one of the most prophetic pieces of literature in the entire scripture. The amount of specificity, the amount of detail, the amount of accuracy, it's honestly second to none when it comes to any prophecies that you'll find in the Bible. It's honestly fascinating. Once we get into the meat and potatoes of it and we start talking about the different Gentile kingdoms that will come, the amount of detail that he has in these events, and remind you, he's writing this hundreds of years before these events take place, it actually leads non-believing scholars to want to speculate that this book was written later than it actually was, because there's no way that they can believe that this amount of detail was put into these prophecies. It's fascinating. All right, next slide. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to I call this the road to Daniel. I kind of model it after like a military term, like the road to war, but it's just to set the conditions for why certain things are happening contextually for the book of Daniel, okay? What happened from the time in Abraham up until the exile when Babylon conquered Jerusalem, and why does it kind of matter? So we're just going to go over all the wave tops of like the big key events throughout the Old Testament, so that this way everyone's refreshed and understands ultimately the Jewish transgression, like their fight against God and His will and their rebellion, but then ultimately God's promises and fulfillments of those promises. All right, so we all know the story of Abraham. That takes place roughly 2000 BC. God selects Abraham. Through him, he decides that this is going to be his chosen people. He's going to use these people to bring the world to know God. And ultimately, he knows that from him and from his seed will come the 12 tribes of Israel, etc. All right, so then about 500 years later, you have a lot of the Jews are captive in Egypt. They were enslaved by the pharaohs. Moses gets selected by God to go into Egypt to liberate them all. We all know this story. They part the Red Sea. They end up at Mount Sinai. Okay? Once they get to Mount Sinai, God gives them the Mosaic Law. Also, is that Fawn? I could email you these if you want.
Oh, okay.
If that's easier. But yeah, so they get to Mount Sinai, and this is when God presents the Mosaic Law to the Jews. So there's like 600 and some laws and rules that the Jews have to follow in order to maintain their relationship and be right with God. This is when the Ten Commandments came, etc. This is when they learn about the tabernacle and they make the Ark of the Covenant, all these things, right? And then from there, Moses takes them out into the wilderness. They get lost in the desert for a while. Moses eventually dies. Joshua takes over. They cross the Jordan. They go into the Promised Land. All right, that takes place approximately 1400 BC. And then fast forward another couple hundred years, you have their first true real king of Israel, which is David. We all know the classic story. He gets selected. He was a farmer's boy. The prophecy was that it would be one of the sons, and the guy's like, hey, here's all my sons. And they're like, no, none of them. And he's like, what about that guy out in the field with the sheep? And he's like, yeah, let me go talk to him. Sure enough, it was David. David kills Goliath. He ultimately becomes the king of Israel. Okay? So I say all this for the key takeaways. And the key takeaways of this 1,000 years of biblical and human history is to outline that God makes promises, God set expectations for the Jews continuously rebel and break those rules that God has given them, and therefore they receive punishment. That's why they spent so long out in the wilderness. That's why the entire generation had to die before they could see the Promised Land, all these things, right? And it's ultimately because God makes good on his promises. And then ultimately, at the end of that 1,000 years, God and Israel are finally united in Jerusalem. All right? Under King Solomon, they eventually build the temple, which we'll get into in the next slide. But just understand that. Understand the big key picture is that 1,000 years is God gives them rules. The Jews break the rules, and that is the transgression, is this constant tug of war between the Jewish people and God. And God continuously punishes them. He humbles them. They get right with God. They ask for mercy. God gives them mercy. They do it again. And it's just this endless, vicious cycle. Okay? Next slide. So then from about that time, that's when King Solomon takes over. He builds the first temple. After King Solomon's death, the kingdom ultimately splits. You have a northern kingdom. You have a southern kingdom. They each have their own respective king. All right? And then you have a wave of prophecy. You have Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all leading to the fall of Jerusalem. All right, so the big key takeaways for this is Israel breaks the rules, the kingdom's divided, God continues to be patient, and every time he's patient, he's sending more and more prophets to them to warn them ultimately of the coming wrath that will be God's wrath on them for their transgression. They ignore all of this, and it ultimately comes to a head at the exile, when the kingdom of Babylon conquers Jerusalem and destroys the temple. Okay? Do we have any questions on that? I know I just covered like 2,000 years of Old Testament biblical history in like 5 minutes. But I just want to paint a picture of this constant tug of war between God and his people, and how God continuously allows them to be punished because of their transgression. And it all comes to conclusion when they're exiled from the promised land that they were told about 2,000 years ago when God made his initial covenant with Abraham. Okay?
Christian, just one thing. Just notice in the succession of prophets that God never leaves himself without a witness. So it wasn't as if he just left the nation of Israel on their own. He continually sent his folks, his prophets.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, take us to the next slide. All right, so let's wrap this up with the context, and then we'll get into the book of Daniel. All right, so at this point, as I mentioned, the Jews have ignored all the warnings and promises of God. All the prophets warned them that this would happen. They ignored it, so now they've lost their land. The Babylonians came in, they seized the city, they ransacked the temple, they burned down the temple, and a bunch of Jews got killed, a bunch more got enslaved, etc. All right, next slide. So Jeremiah's prophecy, and this one's important because Jeremiah specifically prophesied that this would happen. All right, so in Jeremiah chapter 21, verse 7, he says, "After that, declares the Lord, I will give Zedekiah, king of Judah, his officials and the people in this city who survived the plague, sword and famine, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to their enemies who want to kill them. He will put them to the sword. He will show them no mercy or pity or compassion." So Jeremiah right there is letting the people know that God is ultimately going to allow this guy who enters the scene now as King Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of Babylon, to essentially exert his will over Jerusalem. All right? Chapter 22, verse 25, "I will deliver you into the hands of those who want to kill you, those who fear Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon and the Babylonians." And then again in chapter 27, verse 6 through 7, "Now I'll give you all your countries into the hands of my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. I will make even the wild animals subject to him. All nations will serve him, and his son and his grandson, until the time of the land comes. Then many nations and great kings will subjugate him." It is important to remember and note verse 7. All right, and the reason for this is later when we get into the follow-on chapters. I'll reference it again, but just understand here that Jeremiah is giving them essentially a window of how long Babylon will control what's going on. And it states that it'll start with Nebuchadnezzar, it'll go to his son, and then ultimately to his grandson. So just remember that, because there's some ambiguity later as to who this one guy is that I'll be talking about in the coming chapters. Just remember that it's Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. I'll circle back around to this. I'm just letting you guys know now. The key takeaway is God told the Israelites that this would happen, and God always fulfills his word. All right, next slide. Keep going. All right, so Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles of the temple. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylon and put in the treasure house of his God." All right, so this leads us to our first point. Could you imagine being a Jew at this time? Could you even begin to imagine? You've heard all the tales, you've heard all the stories, the history of how your people were enslaved in Egypt, how your ancestors were ultimately freed from their captors by God, how they parted the Red Sea, how they took him into the wilderness, all the trials and tribulations that they had in the wilderness, how they eventually crossed the Jordan. They finally took the Promised Land, and then God was with them as they led these military conquests to just take over the entirety of the Promised Land. They build this beautiful city with big walls and a nice, huge temple under King Solomon, and then ultimately, God allows this other army to come in and just completely destroy it. To just completely desecrate and destroy the temple, to take all the sacred items, all the gold that they've been carrying for probably 1,000 years, that they got from the Egyptians, I imagine. Like, could you imagine that these pagan Gentiles just came in and desecrated your Holy Land? Could you even begin to imagine how guilty they would feel? How just humble they had to have been to understand that they were warned over and over that this would happen, and to see the wrath of God happening in your life, like, it would honestly be mind-blowing. All right, take us to the next slide. All right, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude of every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel the name of Belshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. All right, so what's happening here is, first of all, we're now introduced to Daniel. So who was Daniel? Daniel at this point was like in his early teens, probably 12, 13, 14, somewhere in there. We learn that we know he's a Jew, and he comes from Judah. We know that he was brought into this inner circle, this indoctrination program, if you will, where the Babylonians were stripping them of their identity, stripping them of their culture, and teaching them to essentially become this wise man, advisor role capacity to serve in the kingdom for the king. All right, we know that Daniel was with a couple of his friends. They're named here. But ultimately, it was, like I said, to strip them of their culture, to cleanse them of their culture, of their identity, and then make them into this new Babylonian wise man capacity. All right, any question on that? No? All right, good. Next slide. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord, the king, who has assigned you your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other men who are your age? The king should then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please tell your servants for 10 days, give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance to that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the other young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine, and they were able to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. And the king talked with them, and he found no one equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. and Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Right? So verse 21 there kind of foreshadows that he's going to remain in Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar for a while. All right, and we'll get there as we go later on in the book. But go to the next slide. We're going to break this down here. So in verses 8 to 10, we have that incident where Daniel doesn't want to take this food from the king. He doesn't want to drink the wine. He doesn't want to eat these other types of meats and foods that are probably against Mosaic law. He doesn't want to defile himself to God. And he pleads with this official. All right, so despite his circumstances, Daniel demonstrates his faith and commitment to God by not conforming. God then softened the heart of the official, and this ultimately shows that God was with Daniel. All right, Daniel is not doing these things on his own accord or of his own ability. All right, God is with Daniel throughout this entire book, and you'll see it time and time and time again. But this is the first time it's noted. All right, go to the next slide. All right, Daniel then said, so verses 11 through 20 illuminate God's involvement with Daniel. So not only did Daniel deny the food, but he was healthier and more nourished off of the food he was given than what the king provided. It shows that God worked with him. He protected him. Not only did he protect him, but he protected the official that God softened the heart of in the first place. But then he made sure that Daniel and his friends excelled in their studies. And this shows that God has intention of using Daniel in this capacity. God has a purpose for Daniel. That's why Daniel is thriving. That's why he is succeeding. All right, next slide. And that is essentially the end of chapter 1. All right, so today was just mostly supposed to serve as this introduction capacity to Daniel. All right, who is Daniel? Why am I teaching Daniel? What brought us here to Daniel? And ultimately set the table for what's to come. All right, so now we know that Daniel is in captivity by the Babylonians. Why is he captive in Babylon? Don.
Why is he captive?
Mm-hmm. What happened? We're going to do a little check on learning to make sure everyone's tracking. So what happened to lead to Daniel not being in Judah anymore, but being in Babylon, and ultimately in this indoctrination program? Who wants to help him? River.
God punishing the Jews for not listening to what he was saying.
Yep.
Because he's like, fix yourself or you're going to get punished.
Yep.
And pagans came through and like decimated them.
Absolutely. Yep.
And then the Babylonians took over.
Yep. Daniel is a captive in Babylon because ultimately he was captured and enslaved. And the reason why he was captured and enslaved is because of the fall of Israel and ultimately Jerusalem. And the reason for that, if we keep walking the dog backwards, is because of the Jewish transgression. And this was God selecting King Nebuchadnezzar essentially to allow him in Babylon to exalt his will over the Jewish people because of their transgression. All right? We then learn that Daniel was selected by officials to be indoctrinated into this wise man role. We learn that Daniel risked his life by demonstrating his faith and resisting the indoctrination. Daniel knew that if he failed and his appearance looked less than that of the people that were taking the food, he would be killed. His friends would probably be killed. The official who he was debating with to try to get this approved would most likely be killed. And he took that risk out of faith for his God, out of faith to stay true to that Mosaic law and his culture. All right? And then ultimately the biggest key takeaway is that God is with Daniel the entire time. God was with him during that 10-day diet, if you will, the Daniel diet of where he only ate vegetables. All right? And then he was with him from that moment all the way up until Nebuchadnezzar's review. And he ensured that Daniel thrived and that he succeeded in all of his studies to the point that Nebuchadnezzar found him and his friends 10 times more knowledgeable than any of the other wise men in the program. All right? And then I end it here with some rhetorical questions. is imagine that you were Daniel, okay? And imagine that you witnessed these things, that you witnessed the fall of Jerusalem, that you witnessed the destruction and ultimately the pillaging of your temple and the ransacking of all the sacred items and all these things, and then you were enslaved by the king, okay? Imagine then that instead of being enslaved for manual labor, like probably a bunch of them were, that you were hand-selected to be part of this program to become a wise man. That's an opportunity, right? Many of us would see that as an opportunity. Many of us would honestly feel lucky, if we're being honest. Like, man, I could be breaking rocks and building a Babylon, sacrifice temple right now, but instead all I gotta do is learn. Like, this is great. And you're feeding me, and you're giving me all this, like, the best wine in your kingdom, the best food in your kingdom. How many of us would honestly stay true to our faith? And I don't need anyone to answer it. This is rhetorical. I want you to think on it. But would you do what Daniel did? Or would you just seize the opportunity, give up your faith, and just be like, well, this is my life now. I guess I'm a Babylonian. I guess I'm going to become a wise man now. And just completely conform to that new set of circumstances that you face. How many of us would honestly go the Daniel route? As a young teen, all by himself, without any of his parents or any of his friends except for his Jewish companions that are in the program with him. And instead of that, he willingly is ready to die for his faith. And we'll see it again as we go forward in the chapters. But he's willing to simply die instead of eating food that he knows would be disgraceful to God because of the Mosaic law. That he's willing to just end it all instead of seizing this opportunity, instead of pursuing the comfort of this world. That's pretty deep, isn't it? And we talked about it a lot, especially when I taught James last time back in the fall, is you can't serve two masters, right? You could either be friends with the earth and be friends of this physical life that we have and pursue comfort and pursue pleasure, and simultaneously you're going to become an enemy of God, or you can give up those things and pursue God, but then you're going to be an enemy of the world. Your friends are going to talk badly against you because you're not willing to do what they want you to do. Your friends are going to talk and say that you're weird because you're always at home and you're not doing certain things, or whatever the case is, right? Like, you're going to face trial and tribulation. You're going to have to give up certain things because you're instead focusing on God, right? This is the same story. The same story. Daniel chose to live for God, and living without God wasn't worth living. So he was ready to die, like as a kid, just because of food. Just because of food. Like, that's pretty deep if you think about it. I don't know, honestly, if I'm strong enough to be like Daniel. Honestly, and if all you honestly think about it, I would honestly imagine most of you aren't either. Like, if you know you're not supposed to eat a steak and I give you a steak, are you going to eat the steak or are you going to let me shoot you? You know what I mean? Like, you're probably going to eat the steak. You know what I mean? Like, if we're being honest about it. So that's just something to think about as we go forward today. All right, take us to the next slide. And that leads us into chapter 2, which I'm not going to get started today. Actually, I will, because chapter 2 is probably going to take a while. So we might as well. At least for a little bit, because I imagine chapter 2 is going to take us a couple Sundays anyway.
Can I ask a couple questions?
Sure. Questions?
That's why I had all these questions in my head.
Okay.
All right, so the book of Daniel was written by Daniel.
Yes.
Okay. King, what's his name?
Nebuchadnezzar.
He's the one that gave Daniel the name
Belshazzar. Yeah.
So and you answered that with when you told me that he would pretty much rebel against being Babylonian and staying true to his faith, so he never took that name. And why do they never say the guard's name that truly helped them in the beginning?
I don't know. I don't know.
Like, these are the things that like pop.
Yeah, honestly, I don't know why.
That's the name issue
Sure.
first.
Yeah.
We know him as Daniel because he's writing, and so he never gave up his Jewish name. But in his interaction with the king, he was Belshazzar.
Yeah.
right, as we see later. And we do see that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are numbered by their Babylonian names. So I think it's just the fact that Daniel was writing this.
Yeah.
So,
And the purpose of that, once again, was to strip them of their identity. Like, if I want to take you, Donald, and make you into a completely new person with a different set of morals, a new code of ethics, I need to strip you down to your core, right? And part of that would be removing, basic training, but they do it in basic training, right? Like, you're no longer called Donald, you're called private or recruit or whatever it is, right? And the reason for that is to strip you of even your identity, right? And that's why they gave them new names. Also because the second layer to that is because of the capacity in which they would serve, right? Because they're entering the king's court, they're going to be wise men and advisors for the king, so therefore they need a Babylonian name because they're part of the staff of the king, right? But as far as why was the official not named, I don't know, honestly. Terry, you had a question?
Is there any indication, although he was 12 or 13, he was constricted to, to do all this? How old was he when he wrote the book itself? Is it at what point in his life or what incident triggered the book?
Yeah, so he writes them much later, and the reason why some of the books much later. So he enters captivity roughly, I think it's about 600 BC, all right? And once again, he's already in his teens, and he serves King Nebuchadnezzar all the way until the death of King Nebuchadnezzar, and then ultimately beyond that and beyond that and beyond that, right? And I don't want to steal my future thunder here because, like, there's more kingdoms coming and all these different things, right? But we know that this book, can you go back to the last slide of the scripture of it? Go back one more. Right here. So verse 21, and Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So Daniel's writing this, and he already knows that he's going to be living there until King Cyrus, which means that he wrote this book after he's working for King Cyrus. And King Cyrus is a king of the Persian Empire that defeats Babylon eventually. All right, so he probably wrote this book 539, 538 BC, when he's already an old man, just reflecting back on his history. Any other questions?
I have a comment.
Sure.
Can you start calling the King Neb?
I do. I do. Yeah. Once I start chapter 2, you'll see for the first slide or two, I call him Nebuchadnezzar, but then I just refer to him as Nebi from then on out because I'm sick and tired of typing like 20 letters every time I type this dude's name. But yeah, let's try to drive forward with this and gain some ground. Next slide. Okay. Yeah, this is a lot. All right, here we go. So in the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had some dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. Also, let's stop right there. Actually, this is a good talking point because I just remembered a conversation that I had with Jeff as I was working on the latter parts of this. Let's think about the Christmas story. And I don't want to derail from this too much, but it's just a cool fact that we're going to bring up, and it'll pay tribute later when we get into the later books of this. But who comes to find Jesus after he's born? Think about the Christmas story. So you had Mary, you had Joseph, you had, what's up? 3 wise men, right? What were the wise men called? They were called Magi. Okay? Where did they come from? Were they Jews? They were sent looking for the king, which was Jesus, right? After they talked to King Herod. And then King Herod sends them. Yeah. But they originated not from King Herod. They came to Jerusalem first, and then they go to Bethlehem. I'll just get to the point. The Magi that come to look for Jesus are the same people that Daniel's serving in the capacity of right now. So Daniel essentially becomes the leader of the Magi. He teaches the Magi. He creates the Magi, which later, 500 years later, about, plus or minus, come to find Jesus. And once again, they're pagan Gentiles. And we'll get into that later when we get into chapter 9 and we talk about the Messianic. Because of the teaching. Yep.
Centuries and centuries and centuries of
Yep.
like teaching and like his teachings being like passed on and on.
Yep.
They would expect them to find Jesus.
Exactly. And we'll get into it in chapter 9, because not to jump the gun here, but in chapter 9, Daniel gives a prophecy, or Daniel receives a prophecy from an angel of God that is a 490-year timeline, and with a definitive start point. And he's told after the 483rd year of this prophecy, the Messiah will come. So Daniel knows to the day when the Messiah is going to come, which is why the Magi come to look for him, because they saw the star in the east, like they were anticipating. They're like, it's going to be any day now. And then they're looking for this star because the Babylonians were astrologers. They have a deep astrology history, and these wise men, as you see here, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers, because that's who the Magi were. Okay, so like they were looking for the star. There was no one better suited to find this new star than the Magi, and they ultimately came to find the Messiah because of the word of Daniel. I just figured that was a good bridge there.
Why is he talking third person? Like, and Daniel will stay there until the King Cyrus.
That's just his style of writing. Yeah, I guess just to
Make it easier for people to read, I guess.
yeah, like, well, that, and just to assert that it is him writing it. Because in one of the books later, King Nebuchadnezzar's writing it. King Nebuchadnezzar's writing, or maybe Daniel's rewriting King Nebuchadnezzar's passage. In either way, it states like, I, Nebuchadnezzar, comma, and then a bunch of things. But yeah, it's honestly probably just his writing style. But we won't get into this. I'll just give you a preface of what chapter 2 is, and then we'll pick it up from scratch next week. All right, so chapter 2 is he's serving in King Nebuchadnezzar's capacity, right? He's a wise man. King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and this dream is troubling to him, so he goes to his wise men. And he says to his wise men, if you really can do your job, I want you to tell me what I dreamed and what the meaning of the dream is, without me telling you what the dream is. And if you can't, I'm going to kill you, because that means you can't really do your job. So then eventually the word gets to Daniel that King Nebuchadnezzar has this ridiculous task that he's requiring of his wise men. Daniel prays on it, and God reveals the dream to Daniel, and Daniel goes to King Nebuchadnezzar and basically tells him what he dreamt and provides an interpretation of that dream. The dream we'll get into next Sunday, but just to give you an idea, if you wanted to read on your own throughout this week, chapter 2, so you're better prepared for next week, it is a dream about a statue. Layers of the statue are composed of different elements. You have a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, you have a belly and waist of bronze, legs of iron, and then feet which are iron and partly clay. There's this statue, and then a rock that's cut out not by human hands, but by God's hands, comes down, hits the statue in the feet, shatters the statue. The rock grows and consumes the world, and ultimately has everlasting rule and dominion over the world. That's the dream. Okay? What Daniel interprets it, once again, if you want to read on your own, is each one of these metals are a different Gentile kingdom. The gold is Babylon. After that, you have the silver, which the chest and arms is the Medo-Persian Empire that conquers Babylon. The next one is Greece, which conquers the Medo-Persian Empire. The next one is Rome, which conquers Greece. And then the mixed composed feet of iron and clay actually represents the future Rome, which is the restored Rome that will exist in the time of tribulation when the Antichrist comes. The rock is Jesus, the Messiah, during his second coming, who defeats the Antichrist, destroys all human man-made kingdoms, and then he installs his own new kingdom that will last forever over the world. So that's essentially chapter 2 in like 2 minutes. We'll go into much more detail, but if you wanted to read ahead, now you at least know where we're going with it. All right? Any final questions? If not, I will close this in prayer.
Daniel's performance in chapter 2 explains why he became the head of the Magi.
And I will cover that. I will cover it. Any questions? I know today was kind of all over the place. My purpose was to just set the table and to prepare you guys to understand who Daniel is, in what capacity he's working, and ultimately just give you the historical context so it kind of makes sense. I hope I did that, and I hope that you guys are prepared to learn, because from here, we're just going to start getting into it. From here, it's going to be all the different things that he's doing, the different prophecies and everything he's doing. It's going to be all scripture-based. There's not going to be as many sidebars going forward. But any questions? We good? All right. Heavenly Father, thank you for once again bringing us here today. I pray that you'll continue to be with us as we learn the book of Daniel and to ultimately find your truth in the words, Lord. I pray that every one of us is ready to receive the word that comes from Jeff later. I pray that it is your words, not his, that he's providing, Lord. And I pray that it ultimately gives us the knowledge that we need to be better Christians in our lives. And I pray all this in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Sure. Yeah, I'll do it.
Have you seen the thing out?
Huh? I don't know. Well, he's in the field.